1940. After 6 months of wartime standoff, Germany hurled the weight of her offensive westward. It was the second time in just a quarter of a century, but this time the Luftwaffe, Germany's mighty air force, was leading the way. Defending troops were rolled back by the German advance. Holland was first to fall, then came Belgium, but France would wait. Nazi generals saw the chance to annihilate the retreating British army. The fury of the invasion had caught the British forces off guard. By the 26th of May, 400,000 men were trapped at the port city of Dunkirk. The only escape was by sea, and on May the 30th, an endless armada converged off the French coast. Warships, barges, ferries, and fishing boats evacuated 340,000 soldiers under intense German bombardment. Winston Churchill later said that wars are not won by evacuations. But at Dunkirk, his country had been saved. The British ducked the German trap, and now the island nation stood alone against Hitler's dreams of conquest. As German commanders strolled through the wreckage of British defeat, all eyes turned to the chalk contours of Dover. But Adolf Hitler respected British culture and didn't wish to destroy her. He felt that German military prowess was enough to deter the beleaguered nation from further bloodshed. For Winston Churchill, peace with Germany was never an option. The stubborn leader dismissed German overtures, telling his countrymen to brace themselves for their finest hour. Along a 2,000-mile coastline, Britain was transformed into an island fortress. Anti-aircraft batteries sprang up like weeds. Road signs were removed to confuse German invaders. Hitler was baffled by Churchill's stubbornness, and on July the 16th, he gave up on diplomacy. Before invading Britain, the Royal Air Force needed to be destroyed. The task was put into the hands of the Luftwaffe's flamboyant leader, Hermann Göring. Göring was delighted by the challenge. The battle to come would be decided in the air, and when Britain fell, it was he who would receive the credit. Invigorated by German air dominance over Europe, Göring predicted the RAF would be crushed within weeks. The stage was set for the Battle of Britain. Back in England, the Royal Air Force braced for war. One of the RAF's most important weapons was this, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin had a 12-cylinder inline design, which in 1940 supplied just over 1,000 horsepower. It would power the two major Battle of Britain fighters. The older of the two aircraft was the Hawker Hurricane. It was a single-seat fighter with 8 wing-mounted Browning machine guns. It first flew in 1935, and by 1940, it was the RAF's most numerous fighter. The other RAF fighter was the brainchild of aircraft builder R.J. Mitchell. It first flew in 1936, a year after the Hurricane. The new aircraft became known as the Spitfire, a name that will forever be associated with the Battle of Britain. But the key to Britain's defense was a new invention, radar. By 1939, a coastal chain of 20 radar stations warned of enemy aircraft approaching from the south and east. All radar contacts were passed on to Fighter Command headquarters, where the Women's Air Force Auxiliary would follow the action on large table maps. Though the Luftwaffe would choose where and when to attack, the RAF would always see them coming. Back in France, German pilots prepared for war. Victories over Europe filled them with confidence. They outnumbered their British opponents, but their job was more challenging. Royal Air Force pilots were defending their homeland. For them, stalemate meant victory. The Luftwaffe needed to win control of the air. For this task, Göring turned to his proven fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Most Luftwaffe fighter bases were concentrated around Calais, the shortest distance to England. By mid-July, German fighter pilots began testing their British counterparts. Groups of Bf-109s took off towards the English coast, hoping to lure the RAF into the air. As the Bf-109s crossed the channel, the British radar saw them coming. Within minutes, Spitfires were closing on the German pilots. Luftwaffe pilots perfected the art of aerial combat during the Spanish Civil War. Over the English Channel, their experience and efficiency was brought to bear against a less polished foe. By July the 20th, 50 RAF aircraft were destroyed. The loss rate was alarming, especially considering the brunt of the German air offensive was yet to come. Most of the fighting took place off the Dover coast, in a piece of sky which became known as Hellfire Corner. RAF fighters were in short supply, but the most precious commodity was experienced pilots. But the RAF had the advantage of fighting close to home. When a pilot bailed out over the channel, Royal Air Force motorboats were sent to pick them up. As the air war grew more intense, heroes emerged on both sides. One of them was Spitfire pilot Douglas Bader. Bader's contribution to the battle stemmed not from his own deadly skills, but through his ability to pass on his knowledge to less experienced pilots. One of them was a young Spitfire pilot, Johnny Johnson.
He was a great leader, Douglas. He had the qualities of leadership, all the qualities of leadership, which are given to very few. We'd like to think, I like to think, that we inherited something from him. We'd learned something from him. We learned how to conduct ourselves in war. That's what we did.
On the other side of the channel was Adolphe Galland. A veteran of the Spanish Civil War, Galland was a deadly and efficient hunter. But like Douglas Bader, he was also a teacher. Galland liked to instill confidence in young pilots by setting them up for their first kill. To do this, he would fly over the English Channel by himself. When a British fighter attacked, he turned for France. The retreating German plane was tempting bait. If the British pilot was foolish enough to fall for his trick, Galland would radio his young pilots waiting high above their base. As the Spitfire crossed the French coast, the trap was sprung. These decoy duck tactics proved costly to the RAF. Fighter Command Chief Hugh Dowding warned airmen not to fly beyond gliding range of home. To his group commanders, he stated, "I want live flyers, not dead heroes." German fighter pilots went to war with greater experience and discipline than the British. But young RAF pilots matured quickly under fire. By August, it had become clear that except in the turn, the Hurricane was poorly matched against the 109. Although sturdy and well-armed, the Hurricane's top speed of 325 miles an hour meant that it was 30 miles an hour slower than the German fighter. Camera gun footage shows a Bf-109 pilot's view as he closes in and attacks a Hurricane. While the Hurricane may have been slower and less maneuverable than the Spitfire, it was far more numerous. Hurricanes outnumbered Spitfires by almost 2 to 1. To best utilize its combined fighter force, the RAF decided to fly its Hurricanes against German bomber formations and let the Spitfires deal with the Bf-109s. But German bombers were yet to make their debut over Britain. Then, on August the 1st, 1940, Hitler told Goering to prepare for Phase 2 of the battle, a massive air assault to crush Britain's air defenses. Goering was delighted. He could finally launch the strength of his bomber force against British industry and airfields. The start of Phase 2 was given the code name Eagle Day. British intelligence warned that an attack was imminent. RAF pilots knew what was coming. They just didn't know when. On August the 13th, 1940, RAF fighter pilots received the call. Vast formations of German bombers were closing on Britain's south coast. Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled into a hastily organized departure. Eagle Day had arrived with all the fury and intensity of two nations at war. The Battle of Britain had begun. Over the English Channel, 40 Ju-87 Stukas were heading for the city of Southampton. The lumbering dive bombers were escorted by a squadron of Bf-109s. The formation was spotted by a group of Spitfires flying overhead. With the afternoon sun at their backs, the Spitfire pilots tore through the fighter escort, savagely attacking the vulnerable dive bombers. Camera gun footage illustrates the fate of a Stuka being pursued by a Spitfire. Nine of the dive bombers were shot down, and the rest limped back to France. German commanders conceded that the Stuka was no match for the Spitfire. The shrieking dive bomber that wrought havoc over Europe was withdrawn from the Battle of Britain. Germany's Bf-109 remained the RAF's most lethal adversary. But as the Luftwaffe stepped up its offensive, the fighter's greatest weakness was exposed. Its limited range allowed its pilots to fight over Britain for only 20 minutes. To provide long-range protection for his bombers, Hermann Göring turned to the twin-engined Me-110 destroyer. The destroyer had twice the range of the 109, but it was also slower, less maneuverable, and its size made it an easy target. Its performance against the Spitfire is best illustrated by this footage from a destroyer's camera gun. Here, the German chases a Spitfire over the British coastline. Just as he seems to have the British pilot in his sights, the Spitfire simply pulls away. The first major assault against Britain had mixed results. The Luftwaffe claimed to have shot down 70 planes. The actual figure was 13. The Germans lost 33 aircraft. But what frustrated German pilots most was that the RAF always seemed to know where the Luftwaffe was flying. The answer was, of course, radar. Yet the Germans never seemed to appreciate its importance. After only a few raids against British radar sites, Göring decided that further attacks were pointless. It was the greatest military blunder of the Battle of Britain. And on August the 15th, Göring's Luftwaffe would pay the price. That afternoon, Göring launched a massive bombing raid from German fighter bases in Denmark and Norway. Most of the fighting thus far had taken place in the south. Göring was convinced that a raid against northern England would take the RAF by surprise. It didn't. The German bombers were watched for over an hour by British radar. RAF pilots had time to get into an attack formation with the sun behind them. German pilots didn't see them coming. Stunned by the fury of the British attack, a formation of Heinkel 111s dropped their bombs before reaching the target. A second wave did make it to the target, only to be attacked relentlessly on their way home. 29 German aircraft were downed without the loss of a single RAF fighter. Yet German commanders still didn't realize the significance of British radar. The Battle of Britain wasn't proceeding the way Göring had planned. When he visited his fighter squadrons on August the 21st, the frustrated leader tore into his pilots. He called them cowards, blaming them for jeopardizing Hitler's planned invasion. Goering then gave his pilots free rein to bomb targets in all British cities except for one. Hitler wanted the British capital intact when it fell under German control. London was strictly off limits. On August 24th, over 100 Luftwaffe bombers attacked the RAF's main fighter bases in the south. Manston Airfield near Dover was completely destroyed. Further north, fighter bases at Ramsgate, North Weald and Hornchurch were pounded relentlessly. Hangars were destroyed, operations buildings were leveled and communication lines cut. When RAF fighters returned home, they had nowhere to land. The new German strategy was working. Hitler and Goering were delighted by the course of battle. The defiant RAF was reeling towards destruction. Hitler ordered that the invasion of England begin on September 21st. By the end of the month, a swastika would be raised over the British Houses of Parliament. RAF reconnaissance reported that an invading force of German troops was assembling along the French coast. The fate of Britain was in the hands of its beleaguered Air Force. Fighter Command Chief Hugh Dowding admitted that the RAF needed a miracle. Little did he know, he had already been given one. On the night of August the 24th, 1940, 2 German bombers got lost flying to their target. Met with stiff anti-aircraft fire, the Germans unloaded their bombs and headed for home. What the airmen didn't realize was that they had been flying over London. Neighborhoods were set ablaze, and civilians were killed as they left pubs and theaters. For Londoners, it was a night of terror. For the RAF, it was the answer to a prayer. It is likely that Churchill knew the bombing was a mistake, but it didn't matter. An opportunity was handed to him. The following night, a squadron of RAF bombers set out for Berlin. The raid caused minor damage, but it was an embarrassment for Goering, who had once promised that enemy bombers would never reach Berlin. After the raid, Goering promised Hitler that it would never happen again. But it did. For the next 4 nights, the RAF dropped bombs over the German capital. Churchill was intent on hitting the Germans until the Germans hit back. After the 4th raid against Berlin, Hitler had had enough. He promised to strike at Britain's heart. London was to be destroyed. On September the 7th, British radar detected a massive German formation bubbling up over Calais. The approaching force was so large, RAF commanders were convinced that an airborne invasion was underway. In fact, hundreds of bombers were heading directly for London. The sheer size of the German formation was too much for the RAF. By nightfall, London's East End was in flames. For the next week, German bombers attacked London round the clock. Historic streets, monuments, and churches were destroyed. 2,000 civilians were killed, and over 10,000 were injured. But the attacks played into the hands of the RAF. While German bombers concentrated on the capital, Fighter Command had time to rebuild. Airfields were repaired, and lines of communication were reopened. London's plight was the RAF's reprieve. The tide of battle was again with the British. But Hermann Goering was convinced that Britain was on the verge of collapse. On Sunday, September the 15th, he ordered one last big raid over Britain. He assured his tired airmen that one final blow would knock the British people into submission. The raid involved 400 German bombers and over 700 fighters. Once again, the target was London. The 1,000 German planes gathering over the French coast made a distinct impression on British radar screens. Fighter Command threw everything it had into the battle. Over 300 Spitfires and Hurricanes were sent aloft to greet the weight of the German Luftwaffe. It was the climax of a long summer's struggle. The deciding moment in the Battle of Britain had finally arrived. From the moment the Germans hit British skies, they were swarmed by the RAF. As always, the Spitfires took on the fighters, while the Hurricanes attacked the bombers. This monumental clash involved hundreds of pilots from both sides, and soon the clear autumn sky was painted with the spiraling vapor trails of German and British fighters. Cursed with limited range, German fighters were forced to break for home after just 20 minutes fighting. In the heat of battle, many continued dogfighting, only to run out of fuel over the English Channel. Without protection, the German bombers fell prey to the British. By the end of the day, 40 lay in ruins, while many more barely made it back to base. It was a decisive victory for the RAF. Goering insisted that the British could still be defeated, but Hitler no longer believed him. The invasion of England was postponed indefinitely. The RAF had won the Battle of Britain. During a BBC radio address, a relieved Prime Minister told his country, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." RAF pilots who flew during the war came from a variety of backgrounds. Many were students, a few were engineers, and some were just sportsmen who thought their hunting skills would make them natural dogfighters. But all of them learned to fly in this, the de Havilland Tiger Moth. The two-seat Tiger Moth was the standard RAF trainer during the 30s and 40s. The students learned to fly by sitting in the front and listening to the instructor. When the aircraft reached a safe height, the student would take the stick and begin flying. When the young pilot gained the instructor's confidence, he was allowed to make his first unglamorous landing. During the early days of World War II, students only flew an average of 7 hours before moving on. Britain was fighting for her life, and it needed to get its boys into the battle. Having won the Battle of Britain, the RAF could finally look beyond its home skies. The British island of Malta was a vital toehold in the Mediterranean. It lay between Mussolini's Italy and German-controlled Libya, and not surprisingly, it had been under siege since the beginning of the war. For 2 years, a small but valiant group of Hurricane pilots managed to keep the island under British control. In November 1942, an Allied assault force came ashore in Algeria and Morocco. At the port city of Algiers, an RAF supply unit marched ashore and set up an airfield. Soon after, a squadron of Hurricanes flew in from Gibraltar. The Allied goal was to envelop German forces and drive them from the continent. Standing in the way was the formidable armor of Germany's Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. The RAF's Hurricane, which had defended the skies over Britain, was modified to deal with Rommel's tanks. It was armed with 2 armor-piercing 40mm guns mounted under the wing. The Hurricane squadrons were joined by American P-40 Tomahawks, given to the RAF under the provisions of Lend-Lease. The barren deserts of North Africa left Rommel's forces nowhere to hide. American and British pilots swarmed German convoys, driving Rommel's tanks northward. By the spring of 1943, the German army was in full retreat. As the Allied soldiers advanced towards the Mediterranean, they waded through the wreckage of the Allied air assault. By May, North Africa was under Allied control. In the skies over Europe, 2 old adversaries continued their struggle for air supremacy. But much had changed since the Battle of Britain. By 1941, RAF pilots were making daily sweeps over the French coast. Now it was the Germans who were on the defensive. War had matured the British airmen. Their tactics had been refined, and so had their aircraft. The Spitfire 5, seen here pursuing a Spanish 109 in German markings, had become the RAF's standard fighter. The Spitfire 5's greatest improvement was power. The new Merlin engine provided over 1,400 horsepower, 400 more than its predecessor. The 5 was often considered the easiest to fly of all the Spitfires. In 1941, the aircraft outfought its German opponents, but its supremacy was about to be taken away. In late 1941, Germany unveiled the Focke-Wulf 190. This deadly fighter would turn the tide of the air war, once again igniting a frantic race for air superiority. The Focke-Wulf was produced in great secrecy. Even as it was turned over to the Luftwaffe, the British were still unaware that a lethal adversary was about to emerge. In September of 1940, several RAF pilots reported seeing a new German fighter. Such claims were dismissed by British intelligence. Then a Spitfire returned to base with camera gun footage showing a new German fighter with a radial engine. Soon these encounters became more common, and the Royal Air Force grew all too familiar with the Focke-Wulf 190. The Focke-Wulf outclassed the Spitfire 5 in almost every way. It was faster and had a greater rate of climb. It could reach heights of 35,000 feet, allowing German pilots to jump the British from above. The Spitfire's only advantage was in the turn, but this was little help. During the summer of 1942, RAF pilots suffered heavy losses. Something needed to be done, fast. In England, Rolls-Royce was building a more powerful engine for their new Lancaster bomber. The supercharged 1,600 horsepower Merlin caught the attention of Fighter Command. The RAF asked if the new engine could be used in its fighters. The result was the Spitfire 9. The bigger Merlin engine wasn't designed for a fighter, and the Spitfire's nose had to be lengthened by 18 inches. The Spitfire 9 was produced for the RAF as a stopgap measure, keeping the Focke-Wulfs at bay until a true replacement came along. But in searching for an interim solution, the British had found the answer to the deadly Focke-Wulf 190. By 1942, America was committed to the war, and the US 8th Air Force had arrived in England. While the RAF bombed Germany by night, the Americans preferred to fly during the day. RAF's Fighter Command was given the job of protecting American formations. Spitfire ace Johnny Johnson recalls.
We liked to squat in the 8th Air Force because the Germans reacted in strength, sometimes in gaggles of 50 Focke-Wulfs and 190s, and we had some very hectic air battles.
B-17 flying fortresses bristled with gun turrets. American crews were fighting for their lives, and they had a reputation for shooting at any fighter that came close. Spitfire pilots decided to create a protective shield about a mile outside the B-17s. When a German fighter broke through, they left it to the American gunners. The Spitfire's limited range meant that the RAF pilots could only escort the bombers as far as the Dutch border. For the rest of the mission, the Americans were alone. German fighters attacked at will. As the formation headed for home, RAF Spitfires were sent to meet them over Holland. The returning force was always smaller than the one which had departed, but the tattered survivors held their formation.
Well, I think it was a very inspiring sight, to me anyway, when you could see the formation didn't look anything like the immaculate formation which it set out 4 or 5 hours previously. And there were great holes in it and stragglers, engine smoking, which the Germans always set upon the stragglers and so on. But they came on and kept their formation.
In June 1944, British and American fighters cleared the skies over Normandy. The liberation of France had begun. The British assault was concentrated on the eastern flank of Normandy. The Americans landed to the west. In the days to follow, German defenses were rolled back. Airfields were secured, and soon British fighters were ready to land in France. By 1944, British ace Johnny Johnson had been promoted to the rank of group captain. He now commanded a wing of Canadian fighter pilots. On June the 10th, Johnson and his men made history by becoming the first Allied pilots to land in France. 2 days later, Winston Churchill became the first Allied leader to set foot in Normandy. Brandishing a cigar, the triumphant Prime Minister met with his forces.
Winston Churchill came to see us in Normandy. He came and shook hands with us, and we had got some good Martel brandy, which we'd been given to us by the French. And I said to the Prime Minister, we have some good Martel brandy, so I said, can we put a case in your airplane to take back to England? And he said, despite, he said, all the rigors and tribulations of the war, he said, I've never been short of a drop of brandy, so he said, you keep it in for yourselves.
Allied pilots celebrated their successful return to Europe. But war was far from over. German pilots were desperately trying to drive Allied fighters from France. Johnny Johnson and his Canadian pilots met the Luftwaffe in savage air battles over Normandy. But German fighter pilots lacked the discipline of the men who had fought over Britain. During one engagement, Johnson's team downed 7 Germans without losing a single Spitfire. After the fight, RAF Commander Harry Broadhurst visited the airfield with British Army General Bernard Montgomery. Broadhurst instructed Johnson to tell the general about his success.
So Montgomery said to me, he was a little man, of course, very intense little man. He said, what have you done? I said, well, we got in a fight with a bunch of 109s, and I said, we shot 7 of them down, sir. And he said, I wish you'd have told me you'd have shot down 7 Tiger tanks, because he said, that's my headache at the moment.
Montgomery was right. Tank killers were needed more than fighters. For this, the RAF turned to the deadly Hawker Typhoon. RAF officers rode in specially equipped tanks. When the Allies were met by German armor, the ground controller called in his attackers. Typhoon pilots waited 2,000 feet above the battlefield. When they received the call, the formation swept down upon the enemy. The Typhoon's main weapon was rockets. During a typical attack, the pilots would dive in pairs towards the front of a German tank column. At about 400 yards, the first pair would fire its rockets into the advancing German tanks. Another pair would attack the tanks at the back of the column. Trapped in the middle, the rest were helpless against the RAF onslaught. British Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst later said that this job was the most dangerous task the Royal Air Force has ever asked anyone to do. But as the Allies rolled into France, it was also the most important. Years since the London Blitz, and Germany was launching a new form of terror against the British people. The V-1 flying bomb first appeared over London on June the 13th, 1944. The pilotless warhead looked and sounded like nothing else in the sky. But Londoners quickly learned the distinctive drone of the V-1's ramjet wasn't nearly as frightening as the silence that followed. When the engine cut out, the bomb fell onto the city below. The V-1s were launched from ramps in northern France. It didn't have the accuracy to destroy specific targets, but that didn't matter. The flying bombs were terror weapons. designed to wreak havoc on civilian populations. The job of catching the V-1s fell largely to pilots flying the speedy new Hawker Tempest. The V-1 flew at speeds up to 400 miles an hour. The Tempest was slightly faster, but if the pilot was caught going in the wrong direction, the flying bomb would get through. The idea was to attack the V-1s from above, using dive speed to close the distance. During the summer, Germany stepped up their barrage. Hundreds of V-1s were getting through. But the RAF was about to unveil a weapon of its own. An RAF flight lieutenant named Frank Whittle had been working to pioneer a new form of propulsion, the gas turbine engine. Whittle's first engine was tested in 1937. 4 years later, it was ready to be put into an aircraft. The first British jet, the Gloucester E-2839, flew on May the 15th, 1941. Whittle's plane was experimental, but the experience it provided paved the way for Britain's first jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor. The Meteor entered service with the RAF in July of 1944, just in time to challenge Germany's flying bombs. German attacks increased steadily throughout the summer, and despite the efforts of the Royal Air Force, the V-1 had claimed the lives of thousands of British civilians. The squadron of Meteors first encountered the flying bombs in August, but thanks to the Allied occupation of France, the attacks ended the following month. Only 13 V-1s were destroyed by the Meteor. The RAF's only jet of the war never faced German fighter pilots. It was kept at home while proven Allied fighters destroyed what was left of Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe. The fighter pilots who had survived the defense of Britain were now flying over German cities. But the jet age had arrived, and the propeller-driven fighters which had guided the RAF to victory would soon be left behind. These aircraft are Tornado F-3s, the RAF's only dedicated fighter. Tornado fighter pilots belong to 11 Group of the RAF. 11 Group's proud history dates to the valiant defense of England's besieged southeast coastline during the Battle of Britain. Much has changed in the last 50 years, but for the fighter pilot, the pursuit of air superiority remains an elusive and enduring challenge. Today, RAF fighter pilots will fly against each other in simulated combat. The tactical weapons exercise is a war game involving several squadrons and a wide variety of aircraft. Their first order of battle is to engage a group of opposing fighters over an RAF weapons range in the West Highlands. Air superiority must be achieved before the ground attack planes arrive on scene. An attacking force of Tornado F-3s penetrates enemy airspace by staying under the radar. Like the American F-14 Tomcat, the Tornado F-3 has a swing wing design. For maneuverability and low-speed handling, the wing is moved forward to a 25-degree angle. But when speed is required, the wing is swept back to 68 degrees. Today's exercise will bring the opposing fighters face to face in a brief but exhilarating flurry of high-G maneuvers. In the real world, RAF fighter tactics would be far less personal. The Tornado F-3 was designed especially for long-range interception of incoming Soviet bombers. The Tornado's powerful Fox Hunter radar can detect multiple targets from a distance of over 100 miles. In close combat, the F-3's adjustable wings allow for the ideal combination of speed and agility. The rest is up to the pilot. During actual combat, the F-3 pilot can launch its short-range AIM-9L Sidewinder. But ideally, the medium-range Skyflash missile mounted in the under fuselage would prevent the enemy from ever getting that close. In the spring of 1993, Tornado crews were deployed to help enforce a no-fly zone over the splintered remnants of Yugoslavia. The F-3's look-down, shoot-down radar provided a suitable deterrent for any Serbian pilots considering getting off the ground. Monitoring the situation were two RAF Sentry aircraft which had already been deployed to the region as part of NATO's early warning force. The multitude of players involved in the Bosnian conflict meant for a complex tactical picture. Every morning, the E-3 crew receives a friendly air movement schedule which informs them of all NATO flights in and around Bosnia. Most of the unknown contacts were support helicopters moving troops and generals around the combat zone. When the E-3 crew picked up an unknown contact, they issued a warning over an international frequency telling them to land or get out of the area. The information was simultaneously passed on to NATO commanders who decided what action to take. The Tornado fighter has been in service since 1984. It is a true Cold War interceptor designed to stop Soviet bombers. But the world has changed, and the RAF is looking towards a new generation of fighters to carry them into the 21st century. On the runway of the RAF's Flight Test Center outside London, the future has already arrived. Enter the Eurofighter 2000, the RAF's next high-performance fighter. As the name implies, the Eurofighter was the result of a European consortium. The project dates to the early 80s, when Germany, Italy, Spain, and Britain combined their resources to build a common defense fighter for Europe. After years of give and take, a design has emerged that is the shape of things to come. The Eurofighter is a single-seater with modified delta wings. Directly behind the aircraft's nose is a pair of winglets, or canards, which give the pilot better maneuverability and low-speed handling. It will carry a variety of mid- and short-range missiles, and a state-of-the-art weapon system will allow it to track and destroy 6 targets at once. Eurofighter 2000 is due to enter service with the RAF early next century. When it does, the torch will be passed to a new generation. Men and women of the Royal Air Force, who will carry the proud legacy of the few.
Sunday, the plane is sinking and you realize it's not going to stop. What happens after a plane crash? Follow the experts as they look into the causes, then find out how flight teams combat the threat of weather this week on Discovery Sunday.